The Twits by Roald Dahl, page 30 to 38. Mr. Twit gets a horrid shock. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in his garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grizzly old grunion, you rotten old turnip, you filthy old frumpet!" Mr. Twit jumped as though he had been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer. He looked up. He gaped. He gasped. He gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. "Ugh," he said. "Ugh, ugh." "I'll get you for this," shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hold onto the whole time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swash you to a swizzle. I'll gnash you to a nozzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with a stick and cracking him all over his body. The house, the tree, and the monkey cage. But that's enough of that. We can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people do disgusting things to each other. We must get ahead with the story. Here's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and garden. Some house. It looked like a prison. And not a window anywhere. "Who wants windows?" Mr. Twit had said when they were building it. "Who wants every Tom, Dick, and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing?" It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out of, not looking into. And what do you think about that ghastly garden? Mrs. Twit was the gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. "I always grow plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles," she used to say, "to keep out the nasty, nosy little children." Near the house, you can see, Mr. Twit was Mr. Twit's work shed. To one side, there was the big dead tree. It never had any leaves on it because it was dead. And not far from the tree, you can see the monkey cage. There are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit. You will hear about them later. Hug-tight sticky glue. Once a week on Wednesdays, the Twits had bird pie for supper. Mr. Twit caught the birds and Mrs. Twit cooked them. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before bird pie day, he would put the ladder up against the big dead tree and climb into the branches with a bucket of glue and a paintbrush. The glue he used was something called Hug-tight, and it was stickier than any other glue in the whole world. He would paint it along the tops of the branches and then go away. As the sun went down, the birds would fly in from all around to roost for the night in the big dead tree. They didn't know, poor things, that the branches were all smeared with the horrible Hug-tight. The moment they landed on the branch, their feet stuck, and that was it. The next morning, which was bird pie day, Mr. Twit would climb up the ladder again and grab all the wretched birds that were stuck to the tree. It didn't matter what kind of bird they were: song thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, crows, little jenny wrens, robins, anything. They all went into the pot for Wednesday's supper of bird pie. 4 sticky little boys. One Tuesday evening, after Mr. Twit had been up the ladder and smeared the tree with Hug-tight, 4 little boys crept into the garden to look at the monkeys. They didn't care about the thistles and the stinging nettles, not when there were monkeys to look at. After a while, they got tired of looking at the monkeys, so they explored further into the garden and found the ladder leaning against the big dead tree. They decided to climb it just for fun. There's nothing wrong with that. The next morning, when Mr. Twit went out to collect the birds, he found 4 miserable little boys sitting in the tree, stuck as tight as they could be to the seats of their pants to the branches. And there were no birds because the presence of the boys had scared them away. Mr. Twit was furious. "As there are no birds for my pie tonight," he shouted, "then it'll have to be boys instead." He started to climb the ladder. "Boy pie might be better than bird pie," he went on, grinning horribly. "More meat and not so many tiny little bones." The boys were terrified. "He's going to boil us," cried one of them. "He'll stew us alive," wailed another one. "He'll cook us with carrots," cried the third. But the 4th little boy, who had more sense than the others, whispered, "Listen, I've just had an idea. We are only stuck by the seats of our pants. So, quick, unbutton your pants and slip out of them and fall to the ground." Mr. Twit had reached the top of the ladder and was just about to make a grab for the nearest boy when they all suddenly tumbled out of the tree and ran home with their naked bottoms winking in the sun.